we're starting 3, 2, 1. Although Steve Snyder's father, Howard Snyder, was a B-17 pilot stationed in England during World War II, on February the 8th, 1944, his plane, the B-17 Susan Ruth, was shut down over the French-Belgium border after a mission to bomb Frankfurt, Germany. The book tells the true story of events leading up to and after that harrowing day. Of the 10-man crew, some died, some ended in prison camps, and some evaded capture. What makes this book so unique is the very detailed and amazing story of what happened to each crew member, in particular, Howard Snyder, who evaded capture and was missing in action. This book is available in Amazon, Barnes& and Nobles, IndieBond, or where you find books are sold. Today, I am so happy to welcome to Men of Purpose Talk, Steve Snyder. Welcome, Steve. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. Appreciate you having me on your show.
It's a pleasure to have people like you. I always look forward to having this discussion with, very extraordinary people like yourself. And we're going to touch about this book, the great book that you have written about, your father and what led you to write the book. But first, before we dive into this book, tell me, who is Steve Snyder?
Okay. Well, I was born in Pasadena, California, raised there in Southern California. And then I went to college at UCLA. And then after I graduated, I had various sales jobs and had a 40-year career in sales and sales management. And then I retired in 2009. And that's when I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. I'm married, have 3 grown sons. The youngest one just got married a week ago. So that was exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so my wife and I live in Seal Beach, California, which is about 40 miles south of Los Angeles. And it's a quiet little beach town. Love the water. But we have a second home where I'm at right now in Sedona, Arizona, in northern Arizona. So you have the high desert and the beach. So now I'm retired, but I really, since writing the book, I began a new career. Normally each year, except this year because of COVID, I travel all across the United States signing copies of my book at air shows, and I do a lot of PowerPoint presentations to all sorts of different groups, talking about the book and trying to educate people about the World War II and the air war over Europe. But this year, there's no traveling because of COVID, but so I'm doing a number of interviews like this one.
Your book, Steve, is going to be a very personal account of your dad. Why did you write this book?
Well, growing up, I knew the basics of my dad's World War II history. I knew he was a B-17 bomber pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. He flew bombing missions over Europe. And as you mentioned, in February of 1944, he was shot down. And after he bailed out, he was missing in action for 7 months, but evaded capture and finally made it back to England. But I really didn't have time to delve into my dad's war history in more detail until I retired. My parents had kept a lot of material about the war years, and I just wanted to go through that and organize it and get more detail. At that time, I had no intention at all of writing a book. And there were 2 items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down. That's absolutely riveting, which is in the book. And the other item were all the letters that my dad had written to my mother while he was stationed in England, which he had kept. And just sitting down and reading those letters was fascinating. My dad was very candid. In his letters, he talked about what it was like to go on bombing missions, what life was like in England and London at the time, what life was like on the air base he was at, escapades of him and his crew. And I just became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew, and it became my passion. I started reading book after book about the air war over Europe. I went on a quest to find relatives of all his crew members, to ask them what information they might be able to give to me. I went on the internet and spent countless hours doing research, downloading declassified military documents. Joined a number of World War II organizations, started going to reunions, listening to veterans tell their stories. And finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story of my father and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. People needed to know about it. So I decided to write a book.
You wrote this book, and how has been the response from your family members concerning the writing of the book?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I had no writing background or training at all. And so when I published the book, you know, it was a big surprise to all my family. Well, my family knew I was writing it. But, you know, my acquaintances and friends, they were pretty surprised that I wrote a book. And I think they were surprised that it was so good. But it's really just the story is just so fascinating. And that's why it's such an incredible read. The book is all based on firsthand testimony by the people who were involved in the events that took place. What I added to the book, or my contribution to the book, was just adding a great deal of historical information and anecdotes about and surrounding World War II to put the story into context and to give it background. The first half of the book kind of builds up to the day that the plane was shot down. And then the second half of the book is all about what happened after they were shot down.
You must have received or saw some literature concerning the actual moment that the plane was shut down from your father.
Right. Yeah, he did talk about it. But like most World War II veterans, they don't talk a lot about the war. It wasn't until he went to Belgium in 1989, they erected a memorial to my father and his crew near where the plane went down in the little village of Mackinoise, Belgium, just north of the French border. And he and the other 3 crew members that were still living at the time went over for the dedication of the memorial. And there he was reunited with all these Belgian people who helped him and hid him from the Germans during the war, revisited these places, homes and farmhouses where he stayed. And that brought it all back, and he started talking about it then. And then 5 years later, in 1994, I made my first trip to Belgium with my parents, and I got to see everything firsthand, and that's when it became personal for me as well. Excuse me. I've been to Belgium 6 times now, doing research and visiting all these locations. It's a marvelous little country.
Belgium would have been one of the countries that would have been affected directly because of Germany in the war. So they would have been eternally grateful for soldiers like your dad to come and help them.
Absolutely. To this day, the Belgian people are still so thankful and grateful for the Americans, for the Allied, countries coming to their rescue to liberate them from Nazi oppression, 4 years of Nazi oppression and Nazi occupation. And they do a great job of educating the younger generations about the importance of remembering too. You know, here where I am in the United States, you know, this country has never been occupied. You know, they those countries in Europe that were occupied by the Nazis, they saw firsthand the atrocities that they committed and the hardships they had to endure during World War II. It's hard for people in the U.S. to really grasp the horror and the magnitude of what occurred during World War II, since they didn't have to live through it. It was from a distance, from afar.
That's why books like yours would really detail the history of what these veterans did for literally freeing the world from tyranny, from this type of oppression, from a dictator that was hell bent on changing the world to what he wanted. Uh, so the men that was with your dad, have you got the chance to speak with them personally?
Uh, well, B-17 had a 10-man crew, and 5 of the crew made it back home, but 5 of them did not. When
Okay.
their plane was attacked, my dad's plane, he named it Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. But when the plane was attacked by 2 German fighter planes, 2 of the crew were killed in the plane during the attack, and then the other 8 men were able to bail out. But 3 of them died a couple months later when they were captured by the Germans. After my dad bailed out, as we mentioned, he was missing in action for 7 months. He was hidden by Belgian people for a time. And the people who hit my dad were unbelievably brave people. Because if the German secret police, the Gestapo, found out about it, they would be arrested, tortured, and even either sent to concentration camps or shot. And some of the Belgian people who helped my father and other members of his crew did meet that fate. But finally, my dad got tired of hiding. He was almost discovered a few times by the Gestapo, and those instances are described in the book. And it was very stressful for him because, first of all, his plane's attacked, it's on fire. He has to bail out. He comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is. He doesn't know what happened to his buddies on the crew, can't communicate with the U.S. military, and he's being helped by complete strangers who can't speak each other's language. He had a little French-English dictionary and an escape kit he could refer to. And any one of the people who were helping him could be a collaborator and turn him over to the Gestapo. So it was very stressful, but so he got tired of hiding, and word had come that the Allies had landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6th of 1944, and he decided to get back in the fight. So he decided to join the French resistance and start fighting against the Germans. The French resistance was what's called the Maquis, and they were made up of small independent guerrilla groups located all around France. His group was led by a French lieutenant who had escaped from a German prisoner of war camp. There were about 20 members of his group, made up of some Frenchmen, some Belgians, some Algerians. And they harassed the Germans. They disrupted communications. They sabotaged railroad lines. They assassinated German officers. They attacked convoys. And they got their instructions over the BBC, the English radio, through coded messages, and that they were supplied by the British through airdrops. So he fought with them, and there's several encounters that are described in the book as well. And then finally, 7 months after he bailed out, U.S. armies had come up through France after D-Day and liberated Belgium, and that's when he hooked up with the U.S. armies and then made it back to England. And his trying 7 months was over. Excuse me. I'm just kind of getting over a cold here.
That's okay.
But the book isn't about my dad. It's also about what happened to each member of the crew, because something different happened to each guy. And then it's also about the courageous Belgian people who risked their lives trying to help them.
I'm so intrigued by this story. Definitely, I need to get this book. and you need to get his book. So if anyone um, is interested in getting in contact with you via your website and your social media handles, how do they get in contact with you?
Well, as you mentioned, most people acquire my book on Amazon. But my website is stevesnyderauthor.com. Snyder spelled SNYDER. stevesnyderauthor.com. If someone wants an autograph book, they can go to my website. And there's a lot of information about World War II and the air war over Europe and the 8th Air Force on my website. It's just not about my book. It's the purpose of what I do, and my purpose of my website is to educate people about the air war over Europe and the 8th Air Force and what those men went through and the sacrifices they made. There's lots of videos on the website. There's old footage shot during the war, interviews with veterans. There's links to a lot of different sites to learn more about World War II. So it's a very educational website.
I'm very excited about learning, especially getting history, first-hand history from people like you in books like this. Have you ever thought about producing a documentary
I'm sorry, what was that?
surrounding producing a documentary surrounding your
Oh,
book?
yes. I've gone over a couple times with my youngest son and some filmmakers, 2016 and 2018, and we filmed at all the different locations. And we recently produced a 13-minute documentary short that I've entered into a number of film festivals, and it's won some awards. And once it's played in the festivals, they're coming to about an end. Then I'll add that to my website and also my Facebook page and things like that. One of the amazing things that happened during my research is that I found the German Luftwaffe pilot that shot down my dad's plane and interviewed him for the book. And part of that interview is in the documentary. His name is Hans Berger. He just turned 97 years old a couple days ago on October 9th. He lives in Munich, Germany, and fortunately for me, became a translator after the war, so he speaks English. And he gave me some wonderful insight that's in the book about what it was like to go up against the 8th Air Force. And actually, the gunners on my dad's plane shot Hans Berger down at the same time that he shot my dad down. So they shot each other down. So we've become friends. He's getting a little frail now at 97 years old, but and he's the only person who's still living that was involved in the shot down story. All my dad's crew have passed away. All the Belgian people that were involved in the story have all died since, all passed away as well. So that was a pretty incredible experience. And I visited Hans a couple times in Munich, Germany. So it's really been an adventure writing this book. Another thing that's nice about the book is that there's lots of excerpts from letters from my dad, other members of the crew, family members that give it a real personal touch, because you can just hear them, what they were thinking back then. And also there's 200 time period photographs in the book, so you can visualize everything that you're reading about.
Great. I always tend to, in my 2020 mind, try to think what was happening during that time, how people was thinking, what must have been the mindset of the soldiers going in to fight that war. What I mean, the soldiers or the opposing views. I mean, it's Germany against the world primarily, and what would have been the vibe, the atmosphere like at that time? Did you get that type of feeling in your research?
Well, that's a very good question. The world was a much different place back then. Here, there was no social media, there was no internet, there were no cell phones, there was no Facebook, and there was no television. the only way people got information about what was going on in the world was either reading a newspaper or a magazine, but even magazine articles would be way behind. And back then, speaking about the United States, it was unlike today. Most people live in major cities today. Back then, the United States was a very rural population. Most people lived out in the country, and only the wealthy people were able to travel, really. So a lot of these young guys who went off to fight the war, who was just in their late teens, 18, 19, 20 years old, had never been away from home, never been away from their parents. A lot of these guys were just out of high school. Many of them had never even been out of their county, that they lived in, let alone all of a sudden find themselves halfway around the world fighting in a war in these strange exotic places that they'd only read about and had no firsthand knowledge about. So it was a real eye-opener. As I mentioned, a lot of these guys had never been away from home. All of a sudden they could do whatever they wanted to do. They're away from their parents. They could drink. Now all of a sudden now they could drink alcohol. They could smoke. They could chase girls. They could and they're fighting for their lives each day. It could be their last. It's hard to imagine what it was like for those guys, for younger people today, to put themselves in that scenario. But they're called the greatest generation for a reason, and I certainly believe that, because they're, as you mentioned, their sacrifice and courage and bravery saved the world from tyranny, and all the freedoms that we enjoy today and take for granted would not be here without their service and their fighting and dying to preserve freedom.
What was the average age of your dad's crew? That 10-man crew on B, that's 17.
Well, as I mentioned, there was a 10-man crew. Typically, the gunners, there were 4 officers on the plane, and then 6 enlisted men. And the 6 enlisted men were typically gunners, and they were in their late teens, maybe 18, 19, 20. And the officers were typically in their early 20s. My father was an old guy. He was 28 years old, so they called him Grandpa or the old man. But so he was older than most of the crew. But the majority of the guys are in their late teens and early 20s.
He was pretty young also, 28. They were younger in their teens, and having to work together, to accomplish what they had accomplished may have been a task by itself with the age difference and what you were saying in terms of being homesick, being away from home, first time out, seeing this new world, and it's really a fighting for your life. Your literal life is dependent upon what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all of a sudden they had all this responsibility on them to go out, basically save the world. Seeing their friends, their buddies dying, and not coming back, and still going out there and carrying on the fight. They were an amazing group of men. And when they came back home, they just wanted to get along with their lives. They're very humble men. When you talk to these veterans, it's like they don't look at themselves as hero or doing anything special. They just said, no, I was just one of the men who went. We had a job to do, and we did our job, and we came back home and got on with our lives. Either went back to school or married and raised families and became citizens again. All those guys that fought the war, they weren't in. All of a sudden, they were all drafted or volunteered and got trained in a relatively short period of time, and then were sent, over to fight in whatever branch of service, in the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, the Navy, what have you. And there was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. Almost every country in the world was involved. 60 million people died, millions more were wounded, millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of the world forever.
History, yes.
And so it's hard to uh, emphasize enough, the magnitude and the importance uh, of that event.
You mentioned your dad was missing for 7 months, right? And
Yeah.
then he got news of, the French. They landed, and he wanted to meet them. Um, how did he actually meet them? How did he leave that place in Belgium to actually meet with the Allies? How did that happen?
Well, he was being hidden by these Belgian people, and they wanted him to just stay hidden. The people that were hiding him did not want him to join the French resistance because it was too dangerous. He could die fighting against the Germans, and if the Germans captured him, he would have been shot as a terrorist. It would have been much safer for him if he just stayed hidden and waited for the U.S. armies to come up and liberate the country. But I don't know if I would have done that, and I doubt if very many people would have decided to get back in the fight and risk their lives. But he thought other Americans were fighting, risking their lives, and it was his duty to get back and help. So the courage and bravery that he showed was pretty amazing. And he said, well, he wanted, the Belgian people, they knew who the French underground people were. And he rode with a Belgian woman across the border into France, and then they met up with the local French resistance unit, and then he fought with them. But on September 2nd, that's the day that Belgium was liberated by the U.S. armies. Word came that there were U.S. armies in a nearby village of Trélone, France. So my dad walked into the town, in the town square, went up to an army major. Actually, it was an element of Patton's Third Army, that General Patton, that came up through France after D-Day. My dad identified himself, and they interrogated him to make sure he was who he said he was. And then he caught a ride on a convoy that was taking German prisoners to Paris. And then from Paris, he got on a transport and then flew back to his base, or flew back to England and went back to his base. But he didn't go back into the combat because the Air Force had a rule that if you were shot down over occupied territory and helped by the underground, that you couldn't go back into combat, because they thought if you did go back into combat and you were shot down again and captured by the Germans, you'd give up the identity of the people that helped you the first time you were shot down. And so he was sent back to the United States, and he became a B-17 flight instructor for the remainder of the war. But when he got back to England after these 7 months, because my mother did not know what happened to him at all. After he was shot down, she got a telegram from the War Department saying that his plane was shot down, he was missing in action. So she didn't know if he was dead or alive. And here she had a 1-year-old baby girl, Susan Ruth, and then my other sister was born while my dad was missing. So she had 2 little baby girls, and not knowing if she'd see her husband again. So when my dad sent her that telegram when he got back to England saying he was fit as a fiddle, that was a unbelievably joyous moment for my mother and the rest of the family, my dad's parents and so forth.
Wow, that must have been something on your mom. How did your mom handle your dad being missing? How did she go? Did you interview her?
Yeah, that my parents were very strong Christians, and she had, as am I, and she had a strong faith. And some of these excerpts from letters After the plane went down, the wives or mothers or sweethearts would send letters to one another, trying to support each other, not knowing which ones of the crew, what members of the crew would come back and who wouldn't. But back then, I think the country was more religious, and they put their faith, in God that things would turn out okay. My mother also had a very strong support group with her parents, my father's parents, in her relatives. So you just prayed and hoped for the best. And for half the crew, the story turned out happily, but for the other half of the crew, for their relatives, it turned out tragically.
Sad.
Yes, very
Thank
much.
God that your dad lived to tell the story.
Yeah, yeah. If he didn't come back, I wouldn't be here because I was
Yes,
born after the
no,
war.
yes, you're that generation.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a baby boomer from the
The
war
baby boomer
after the war
generation.
years.
Yes. I know for a fact that this war changed history. The men and the women that fought in and was involved in this war, their stories are some of the most amazing stories. It was a war that had to be won because it was literally like a plague, like what we are facing today with this coronavirus that was about to take over the world. So the world had no other choice but to respond to what was taking place in Germany. Mind you, one of my most famous sitcoms is Hogan's Heroes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, Hogan's Heroes, and that's as a little boy. But Hogan's Heroes, is a very old, an old sitcom. But I learned a lot about the war. It's mainly comedy. They mainly put a spin to it. You get an overview of the warfares, you know, Hitler, the war at that time, the Allies, soldiers. They just get basically watered down version of the war, very light-hearted version of the war.
Right.
It's only when I started to look at some documentaries like yourself and what was taking place, I saw what they tried to portray in Hogan's Hero basically was watered down, just for the laugh, just for the humor of it. But you learned a lot, even in the sitcom, and I realized what was actually happening there was really a day-to-day situation of allies coming in. They were basically hiding. They were the Gestapos. They were the German army. How brutal they were against American soldiers. You just mentioned when your dad went up to speak to a general in the army, how they would question him and interrogate him to make sure he is, he said he was, because there were a lot of imposters from the German army. They were imposing themselves as American soldiers, to infiltrate the underground. So there's a lot of truth that was happening even at the Hogan Hero level. That taught me a lot even to the war. That caused me to now look at the war and read about it. And when I saw your um, your interview, I was like, wow, this is definitely a man who is hands-on. So more information. Has there been a time where you were prevented or you were shunned away from acquiring information that you wanted for the book?
No, not at all. I was very fortunate, that I am blessed that I know so much about my dad and what happened to all his crew members. And three of my dad's crew members did become prisoners of war, and so the book talks about their experiences as POWs. Because most people know very little about their veteran because they didn't talk about it, or and but I probably would not have written the book if it wasn't for two Belgian gentlemen Their names are Jacques Lalo and Paul Delahaye, and they were young boys during the war, and they saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis against family and friends. And later in life, they became local historians, and they interviewed all these Belgian people uh, who were involved in the events that took place involving my dad and his crew, and they documented their testimony. And they gave me unbelievably detailed information about events that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I owe them a huge debt. And they provided me a lot of pictures that were taken during the war that are in the book, that are just one of a kind pictures. So I had, my dad, crew members who survived, um, the research that Paul and Jacques did, talking to these people, and then my dad's helpers, because my dad stayed in contact with several of the people who hit him during the war, and they would write letters, and I have those letters, and then all the declassified military documents, war crimes report. So I just had an abundance of information. That was another reason I wrote the book, because I had so much detail, just not broad information, but detail and, firsthand testimony by people that encouraged me and inspired me to write the book. But so lack of information was not a problem at all.
Excellent. There's a lot of books that was written about World War II and what happened during that time. What sets your book apart from the other literature that is out there?
Well, I think if you just look at the air war over Germany, because that's basically what my book's about, it differs because most of the other books that are written fall into two categories. One is that they're very large in scope, and they talk about all the bombing missions and all the bomb groups and all the combat crews. Or they're very narrow in scope. They talk about one man's experience, either flying combat missions or becoming a prisoner of war. Shot Down, my book focuses on one crew and what happened to each member of that crew, and about anything that could have happened to a man in the 8th Air Force happened to my dad's crew. And so half the book talks about what happened after they were shot down. Very few books talk about what happened after men were shot down, evading capture, fighting with the resistance, being hidden by the underground. So it gives a very unique perspective in detail about what happened to individuals of this one crew. Some that ended happily, some that ended very sadly. I think another thing that's unique is all the pictures in the book. I don't know of any other book that has the pictures to document the story like Shot Down does. And then again, all the correspondence, the excerpts from these letters from different people. It's just not one man's recollection of his experiences. You have all these people talking about the events, both from the Belgium side, from the American side. You have the German, pilot's perspective. So it's just a very unique book in that respect.
Steve, this is a great, great interview. I'm really enjoying it. Steve, shut down. Question. It's a bit on the light side, but I know you definitely could answer. If there was a movie that was made concerning Shutdown, who would you like to play your father?
Well, ideally, my youngest son, the one who just got married, he had a rather lengthy acting career starting when he was in middle school. He was on a TV show and in a movie, Lizzie McGuire,
Okay.
that was very popular back around 2000, 2001, 2002.
Okay.
And so that would be the ideal, that my son, Clayton Snyder, would play my father, or at least be in the movie.
Yes.
With some part, if he couldn't play my dad, maybe to be one of the other crew members or something like that.
Okay. Okay. Have you ever thought about having your book in an audio version?
Yes, I actually, the book's available as a as a print book, both hard copy or paperback. It's available in any ebook form like Kindle or Nook or any of that, and it's also available as an audio book.
Great.
Yeah, the only downfall, or the only drawback with the audio book, is that you don't have all those pictures.
Yes.
But it's available in audiobook, ebook, electronic book, and print book. So it's available in all formats.
Tell us again where we can get your website so that everyone will know about it.
Again, my website is stevesnyderauthor.com. Snyder spelled Snyder. And then on Amazon. And again, the complete title of the book is Shot Down: The True Story of Pilot Howard Snyder and the Crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth. Also, there's another nice website you can go to. It's called bookdepository.com. And it's a UK website, and it typically offers a 15% discount. You can pay in basically any currency, and they you get free worldwide delivery, which is nice. There's no shipping charge. That's bookdepository.com. A lot of people outside the U.S. go to that website if they don't buy it on Amazon to get the book.
You're a treat. I love speaking with you. This interview has taught me a lot. I am more excited now more than ever about history. And I think that's was one of the reasons why you wrote the book, to enlighten minds in terms of what took place, not just a broad view, but just a personal account of your dad and these 10 men, and also surrounding what took place around that time. Great job. I wish you all the success in your book. I hope to hear one day that it's a movie. I would really appreciate to look at that movie and your son to be a part of it. That would be excellent. So it's up to you. Last words to you. What do you want to say to our audience? What is one thing that you could say that we could take from the book and use it as a life lesson for today?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. There's a lot. I think that well, there's one is, as I mentioned, just to get an appreciation for the size and courage of those men who went and put their lives on the line, and to appreciate the freedoms that people enjoy today and take for granted, that came as, they say, freedom's not free, and it's not. People sacrificed and died so that we and younger generations can enjoy the lives that we are living today, in peace and freedom. So that's really, and just never forget, the World War II happens, it ended 75 years ago, and so it's fading in people's memories, and we can't let that happen, because it was just too enormous event to let go by.
Excellent. Excellent.
And I've
Excellent.
had a great time talking with you today. My wife and I love traveling to the Caribbean, and have been to uh, quite a few of the islands.
Have you ever been to Trinidad?
No, that's one I need to get to, Trinidad and Tobago. That's like, I think, if next trip, if we go, we'll go to Trinidad and Tobago.
Well, whenever you are in Trinidad and Tobago, know that you have a friend now in Trinidad and Tobago. Feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to, probably show you some sites and stuff. I really
Oh,
appreciate having you.
that'd be delightful.
Thank you again, Steve. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
You stay safe and take care. God bless.
God bless you too.
Thank you.